Hey guys, how you doing? Um, Great job on your midterm this morning. I did curve it by 1 point, and your grades are up on Blackboard. So if you want to take a look at those, they are done. We're going to get to work on the beginning of the Romantic era slash the 20th century, or excuse me, the 19th century, and here we go. So the 19th century, from 1800 to about 1900, is either in music history texts either called the 19th century or the Romantic era. So why romantic? Do they mean lovey-dovey? Do they mean like tender feelings? Well, romanticism doesn't actually imply love necessarily. The name, it actually comes from a literary genre of the time. There was a thing called like a romance, but not like a romance novel that you would think of nowadays, like a Harlequin romance novel. What they mean is a romance was sort of like the thing that came before what we know now as the novel. And it has sort of like an open form that writers could kind of do whatever they want. Um, because there were the other types of books that people would write before kind of had some conventions to them. There were rules. Well, the romance was like, forget about the rules. We don't need any rules here. And so they would call that, a romance instead of a novel. And that sort of that idea that maybe we can break some of the rules, that the conventions sort of don't matter, becomes important in the 19th century. So what happens here is now there is sort of a new fascination with imagination. What we've seen throughout time is that we've become more concerned with the thoughts of the individual, right? The individual might have more rights, the passions, intelligences, wills, things of that nature. Well, that grows even larger, and we even start to give some credence to what people think, what they can imagine, what their brains can come up with. There's also this idea of like yearning and longing being very important during this era as well. So you see that dreams or imaginings are just as important as intellect in this era. What your heart can come up with, what your mind can come up with, is just as important with what you can logically see and observe in the world around you. So the importance of music during this time is that music sort of gives us access to the place beyond what logic can see, beyond what humans can observe and the physical world. Music lets us go past that. So music in the Romantic era, you know how the Classical era sort of we want it to seem effortless. There's this idea of proportion and natural beauty. Well, the Romantic era doesn't really throw that out so much, but it says, let's expand upon that. We want to take music someplace it hasn't been before. So now composers kind of develop their own distinctive voices. Remember when we were talking about the Romantic era, or not the Romantic, the Classical era, and we had said, this music can sometimes be a little bit boring because a lot of it sounds alike and it doesn't necessarily excite your anticipation. Like you never feel like the music is going to take a twist or a turn that surprises you. Well, the Romantic kind of really surprises you. That's what people want to do. They want to find new and different ways of surprising the listener and making them interested in the music. So you're going to hear some things in this era that are going to sound a little bit different than in the Romantic. Orchestras become bigger and they get louder. We talked a little bit today about hearing protection, and it's an issue in orchestras of the Romantic. There are a lot of people that played in these very, very large orchestras. And so you have to sort of imagine that they might have actually done some damage to their own hearing. There's also sort of an emphasis on extremes in texture. So going from one or two instruments playing to going to the entire orchestra playing. And remember that this orchestra is even bigger, and there are some newer instruments and more of them in every orchestra now. And so those texture changes are going to become pretty apparent. We'll be able to hear them really well. Simple sounding music juxtaposed with very complex sounding music, even in the same work or the same piece. We talked a little bit about program music before in earlier eras. We talked about it with Vivaldi's Winter. Remember how Vivaldi based each of the 4 seasons sort of off of a poem, and we looked a little bit at the poem that he used to inspire Winter and what it sounded like. Well, this program music becomes a lot more common and definitely more important in the Romantic era. And the range of each musical element, so things like melody, harmony, texture, dynamics, timbre, all of that, it's going to grow in each period. People are sort of pushing it to extremes. So, the most romantic of all the arts, instrumental music is sort of seen as being the most romantic because it doesn't have words. Remember in the classical we talked about the language of the heart, instrumental music being the language of the heart and vocal music being the language of the mind because it's sort of pinned in by words. Instrumental music doesn't have any words, and so composers sort of had a belief that it could engage the imagination of listeners. And E.T.A. Hoffmann is a music critic, and Beethoven's Fifth Symphony, which is actually the first piece that we listened to in this era, he said of it, "It opens to mankind an unknown realm, a world that has nothing in common with the outer sensual world that surrounds him." So it's like transportation. It takes you somewhere else, at least your mind at the very least. So we have this idea of originality in music, and there is a lot more music in the home. So again, composers, they want to be different. They want to develop their own voice. They want to not just say, Beethoven's music sounds the same as Brahms's music. They want to be different from one another. Now, saying that, they are very different from one another, and one lives near the beginning of the period and one lives more towards the end of the period, so they're going to sound a little bit different just in general, but they sort of have their own voices. They push the boundaries of form. The pieces get longer. Melodies become different. They can be a lot less singable than they were in Mozart and Haydn's time. Harmonies become different. They don't always sound natural. They don't always go where you think they're going to go. Rhythms, they sort of push the boundaries of rhythm and dynamics. And composers start making music not just for the concert hall. They start saying, there are people performing at home. We have kids and adults, people taking lessons, learning how to play instruments. Maybe we should write some music for that audience. We see that a lot of homes from the middle class and up, they have pianos in them. So girls, boys, they take piano lessons. They might play a stringed instrument, a violin, a harp, something like that. And so people say, hey, we should start writing music for that. Again, the Industrial Revolution that we saw sort of start off in the classical era and continue here through the Romantic, goods are cheaper to produce and sell, and so there's like a demand for piano compositions, songs, chamber music, things that can be played in the home. And so composers start saying, yeah, let's write that stuff. I'll write a piano trio. I'll write, a little sonata for violin and piano. I'll write some piano works. We see an explosion of music for the home during this time because a lot more people are playing in their homes. We also see the trend continue of political music and this thing called nationalism. During this time, we have music sort of serving as a vehicle to express some type of agreement or disagreement with a political movement. Remember back in the classical era, we talked about the German national anthem, the French national anthem. We had Chester from the American Revolution. We have these songs that have something to do with a feeling of patriotism. Well, we see that continue, and we see a thing called nationalism. People get the idea that music in this country, in this place, in this area, sounds different than music of other places. So American music might sound different from British music, or British music might sound different than Italian music. Now, I think we've always sort of thought that the English madrigal and the Italian madrigal were kind of different in that they have different languages, but they sound a lot the same. They have sort of the same form. They are built the same way. Well, people started to say, no. In Poland, we have music that sounds Polish, or we have French music and it sounds French. And so there's just sort of this shared language and cultural practices that are defined by music, and it just sort of takes off. People really want to have, a Hungarian identity, a German identity, etc. But again, not all languages and cultures necessarily have a state. These countries, some of them don't exist yet. Czechoslovakia really isn't a thing. Hungary isn't so much a thing as it is a part of the Austrian Empire. There are people that speak Hungarian, but they're part of the Austro-Hungarian Empire, and the people who run it are Austrians, and they speak German. Poland isn't a place yet. I mean, it doesn't have its own country on a map. It's sort of part of Prussia, or it's part of Russia, and parts of it are part of Germany, or here or there, or whatever. So people say, no, we do have a Polish identity. This culture has a music associated with it. So nationalism is a really, really important idea during the Romantic era. So in that, what composers do is they try to express a sense of national pride by using like a characteristic melody or rhythm or a type of dance, a music that would accompany that. One of the most famous nationalistic composers that we're going to learn a little bit about is Chopin. I know it looks like Chopin, but it said Chopin. He's famous for his nationalistic compositions. He was Polish. He didn't live most of his life in Poland, but he wrote most of his music, had a Polish flair to it, even though he lived most of his life in France. We also have transportation and music. We see that in the Baroque and in the Classical era, how do people travel? They travel on these ships with big sails. Towards the end of the Romantic era, the 19th century, we sort of have these big steamships or coal ships. You can get from one country to another across the Atlantic much more quickly than you could at the turn of the 1799 to 1800. From 1899 to 1900, the trip is going to take you a lot less time. We also have better roads for land transportation. We have better systems of getting around. And so there are some commercial and cultural connections. As people need goods from one place to another and they travel, people travel, goods travel. We start seeing people trading more ideas. A Czech composer named Dvorak, he traveled from New York to a Czech American community that was in northeastern Iowa. It took him less than 3 days to get there in the late 1800s. If you think about how long that would have taken, that trip from New York to Iowa in the 1700s, it would have taken you weeks, if not a month, to get there, let alone just 3 days near the end of the century. Publishers, their music can reach farther and farther because now they can distribute music on a pretty much global basis. It can get almost anywhere you need it to go. European musicians could tour the US. American musicians could tour Europe. Again, our book and pretty much everywhere else sort of ignores Latin and South America, Africa, Asia, Oceania. It's not that there isn't music going on during that time. It's just that we're not studying it. It's kind of a bummer to me. So you guys know I feel really strongly about that, but the scope of this class is on what's going on in Western Europe and the United States rather than pretty much anywhere else. It's a huge bummer, but know that there are things going on, but most of history focuses on dead white guys. The telegraph gets invented during this time, the telephone, railroads, steamships, all of these things. In the United States, our transcontinental railroad that goes from one coast to another gets finished in 1869, which means that from New York to San Francisco, you can get there in a week rather than 6 months. It's pretty hard to do that even in a car nowadays. You couldn't do it quite as fast if you only had 1 or 2 drivers. From the Europe to US by ship, you could do it in 6 days. So the world kind of gets smaller, or rather you can get to places a lot more quickly. So let's learn just a tiny bit about this guy, Beethoven, right? Most people know him as the guy who goes deaf. He's the deaf composer, right? Yes, but he wasn't born deaf. And talking about his deafness is actually really interesting. He was considered a great pianist. During his life, he was famous as a piano player. He was born in Germany, and he kind of had a rough life. His father was an alcoholic, and Beethoven was pretty much responsible for putting food on the table when he was a teenager. He was another kind of a child prodigy, somebody that people said, oh, wow, what a great player. We should have him to play for these rich people. And that becomes really important. It's a lot of pressure for a little kid, even for a teenager. So he actually travels to Vienna to study with Haydn. Remember Haydn from the classical era. He's kind of the superstar that everybody just loves him to death. And when Beethoven was young, he studied with him for a little bit. He gets established as sort of a piano virtuoso and a composer. And he goes deaf, he begins to go deaf in his 20s. And a lot of people see Beethoven as being kind of this gruff person, this sort of angry guy all the time. But it really, a lot of it has to do with the fact that your life's passion, your life's work, what you've been brought up to do forever and ever, is becoming more and more difficult for him to do because he can't hear things anymore. He actually writes some letters about contemplating suicide and about how depressed he is about losing his hearing that are actually saved. So those exist, and you could even read them today. He's actually famous during his lifetime. He's considered to be, at his time, the greatest living composer writing instrumental music. Interestingly enough, about his life, he wins custody of a nephew of his, but he ends up not really being able to raise him very well because he is going deaf and has some health problems. When he dies in 1827, he becomes like this national hero of Germany. Just everyone loves him. And instead of really calling himself a composer, he calls himself a tone poet, as in, I create poems with musical sounds. Most of us just call that a composer, but for him, I guess he wanted to make himself kind of fancy. His Fifth Symphony is probably one of his most famous. From the first downbeat, from the first 5 or 6 notes, most people will recognize it. Now, he wrote 4 other symphonies before this, and they're pretty darn good, but this one happens, it premieres in 1808. He writes 9 symphonies in total, and some of them are programmatic, meaning that there's sort of an outside sort of meaning to them. This 5th one, I don't think that it's programmatic necessarily. You probably recognized Beethoven's Ninth Symphony from the end. The finale of it is that song Ode to Joy. Most people have heard that or something like that at some point in their life. That was his Ninth Symphony. But the one that we're going to listen to, and only the first movement, is the Fifth Symphony. So let's listen to a tiny bit of that. Before we go on, most people recognize that opening. It is just iconic. But what I want you to listen for as we go through here is how you hear that opening motive, that ba 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 ba. How do you hear it being changed and shifted throughout the movement? Because it's going to get different. How do you hear the piece go from loud to soft, from a thin texture to a thick texture? So if you're thinking about the overall form, we might have a little sonata kind of like a development if we're in the sonata form. Sounds like we might be back to the beginning or something like the beginning. Could we be in a recap? Maybe. right, there it is. That's only the first movement. So this symphony has 4 movements, just like a lot of other symphonies that we've studied so far. This is not too bad for a first movement, not terribly long. But there you go. There's that first movement. Now we heard that ba-ba-ba-ba. It just kept on going over and over, and it seemed to sort of carry throughout most of the movement. There were a lot of dynamic changes. Loud, soft, loud, soft, loud, soft. Well, we're not going to listen to the full third movement. If you want to go ahead and do that, it's actually on Blackboard. All 4 of the movements are there. The entire symphony has 4 movements, and remember that each one of them is going to sort of have its own. If you look at that rhythm that shows up everywhere, we've got a ba-ba-ba-ba, ba-ba-ba-ba, and you can sort of see that ba-ba-ba-ba, ba-ba-ba-ba is sort of carried throughout almost every part in the orchestra. So that short, 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 long motif, it's played throughout the entire symphony. It's not just the first movement. He kind of carries it throughout the whole thing. It's sort of neat. And it just keeps coming back over and over again. It's almost like that concept of rondo, except it's not what makes the form. It's just this little piece. It's this little rhythm that just keeps coming back over and over again in different iterations throughout the symphony. The dynamic changes are all the time, soft to loud, loud to soft, and it just sort of happens very suddenly. So it's kind of neat. It's definitely a wake-up call from some of the music that we listen to in the classical movement. So again, we have timbres that are different. We sort of see, instead of just the recorder or the flute and the clarinet, we have a piccolo, like a high flute, and a contrabassoon, like a bassoon, but even lower than that. All right, so we have both of those. There are rapid contrasts between winds and strings. In the recapitulation, we heard that little oboe solo sort of all of a sudden. We have double basses, which we don't really hear so much in the classical. So Beethoven sort of uses that. That's his way of making the orchestra seem even bigger than it actually is, because some instruments that we don't get to hear very often, they stand out. So while we were listening to that movement, I noted that it might be a sonata form, just sort of telling you, hey, it's going to be a sonata form. So we had an exposition, a development, and a recapitulation with a coda. And then, each of our movements have their own form. The second movement is a double variation. We have a third movement that's a rounded binary form. So instead of a minuet, which kind of has fallen out of favor at this time, we sort of just have this rounded binary form, which a minuet had, but it's going to be a little bit different this time. Beethoven actually calls it a scherzo, and it usually has sort of a playful, fun character to it. And then the fourth movement actually has, it's a sonata form again, and there is, it has like a little bit of a twist because it borrows something from the third movement and puts it in the fourth movement. So they're actually connected, the third and fourth movements. It goes right from one to the other. So most of the time when you see a symphony being played by an orchestra on a stage, what'll happen is there's like a pause in between the first and second movement. The audience doesn't clap, but there's just a pause to sort of break and say, okay, we've gone from the first movement and we're about to go into the second. Second and the third, and then usually third into fourth. Beethoven doesn't do that. He says, you know what, whatever, we're going right from the third into the fourth, and there's no break. And so it's kind of neat when you have an individual moment in a work that are linked. The whole work can be called a cyclic form. And so that short, 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 long sort of is the motive that connects our entire symphony all the way through it. If you want to listen to a little bit more Beethoven, you can just search for some of these pieces. Even if you look at, just put it into YouTube if you want to. Look at the piano sonata in D minor. It's called The Tempest. It's pretty neat. The violin concerto in D major. It's beautiful. This has sort of well, if you keep going, there's a rondo from this that's really neat too. And then the Sixth Symphony. It's long. If you're just wanting to get a little bit of an introduction to what the Sixth Symphony sounds like, you can even look at Disney's Fantasia, the first Fantasia that they did parts of Beethoven's Sixth Symphony. And actually, Fantasia 2000 did the first movement of the Fifth Symphony, what we just listened to. So they put an animation to it, and it's kind of neat. We are not going to move on. We'll save Schubert for the next time. When I next see you, we'll do just a little bit of review over the Romantic era, what it's all about, and some review of Beethoven and the Fifth Symphony that we just listened to. All right, guys, that's it.